listener production.
Hey, Tara Cassidy with you, and welcome to The Briefing. Have you heard about the class action lawsuit happening in the US aimed at kicking Aussie footballers out of the country's most loved sport?
Something that used to be very American, NFL, gridiron is about as, blue blood as it can get in America. And now it really is starting to be invaded by the outsiders and the international folks.
How our local exports are causing a ruckus in American football is coming up in the second half of this episode. First though, let's get into the headlines with Chris Spiru. It's Monday, the 31st of March.
Morning, Tara. Morning, everybody. Happy Monday, and especially after a big weekend, Tara. I hear the husk in your voice. Mine too. I'm just masking it with some peppermint tea. Health is on the agenda today for the PM as he continues the first week of his campaign trail. Today, he'll be in Western Australia where he will pledge $200 million to redevelop a major public hospital in Perth's east. He'll be accompanied by the state's Premier Roger Cook to plug the $355 million joint upgrade, and that's to St John of God Midland, which will see more hospital, ICU and neonatal beds, operating rooms and a redesign of its neonatal unit. It's a quick policy pivot, Tara, from yesterday where he spent the day spruiking his first official election promise on the campaign, and that was a ban on price gouging.
Yeah, Albo was in Canberra yesterday promising to make excessive supermarket pricing illegal by the end of the year if elected. As to how the government would enforce it, he reckons heavy fines will do the trick.
What we want to make sure is that they know that they're being watched. They know that the government's prepared to take strong action and crack down.
The PM on the ABC there. Meantime, the leader of the opposition, Peter Dutton, was in Western Sydney, where he first hit up Energy Minister Chris Bowen's seat, visiting brickworks in Horsley Park, before heading to Assyrian New Year celebrations in Fairfield and then a Ramadan community event in Macarthur, where he pledged $25,000 in security upgrades for a local mosque, which would include additional surveillance cameras.
Yeah, and it's absolutely no surprise, Tara, that Peter Dutton hit Western Sydney as a first port of call on the campaign trail. That whole region and sort of the areas that he hit has been dubbed over the weekend the mortgage belt. So it's like, we know this is where working class Australians live. This is where, they've been hit the hardest by the cost of living. So very interesting, those places that he's visited, and interesting the commitments he's made. Despite all this, though, we have some positive results coming out for Labor over the weekend. We have new results from the YouGov poll, which found if an election was held today, Labor would pick up 75 seats, 6 more than what was predicted last month. So in the last 6 weeks, there's been some really, way stronger results coming through for Anthony Albanese and for his party for this federal election that's coming up on May the 3rd. Just in case you missed it last week, everyone, May the 3rd. What YouGov found and what a lot of experts have been talking about over the weekend was that it seems that Peter Dutton's work from home policies and public service cuts are not winning him any favours at the moment with the Australian public. They're saying that this real hardline Trumpian approach is something that everyday Australians are not taking a liking to. So it'll be very interesting to see if he pivots away from those policy positions and line of thinking over the next few weeks.
Communities in parts of New South Wales and Queensland are being warned that they could be cut off for weeks after relentless heavy rain and flash floodings hit both states. Residents in areas of outback Queensland have been evacuated, some left isolated due to cut-off roads, and dozens have been rescued, with the Weather Bureau warning the near record-breaking water levels could reach as high as 6.7 metres tomorrow, close to flood levels not seen since the early 70s.
Yeah, that's happening at the same time as residents in parts of Western New South Wales, Peru and Warrego Rivers have also been told to prepare to be cut off for up to 6 weeks by the State Emergency Service. The SES in New South Wales are also continuing to search for an elderly man believed to have been swept away in floodwaters on the mid-north coast, and that was while he was trying to tow a caravan across a flooded causeway. Only the man's car and caravan have so far been found. Rescue authorities have said that in 24 hours alone in New South Wales, there's been 1,700 calls for help, Tara.
Yeah, wow. A lot happening in both states. And the Weather Bureau is saying that while hopefully we've seen the worst of the heavy rain in both Queensland and New South Wales, that the flooding's likely to be ongoing still for some time. And there's still a low pressure system that's brewing off the southern New South Wales coast, they said. And once that passes, then they're expecting another system is going to form and impact New South Wales on Wednesday. So we could still see a lot more rain coming. And for those already drenched areas like Currarong in New South Wales, which is a small town south of Wollongong, they were drenched yesterday, recording over 210 millimetres in 24 hours. So all of these really saturated areas are potentially going to see even more. And some of the footage, I don't know if you saw, Chris, that came out of outback Queensland was pretty devastating.
Yeah.
Just as water as far as you can see, and basically just the tops of roofs in a lot of those videos, which is just devastating. And often people think about, obviously, all the residents that have to be rescued, but there's also livestock. Like there's going to be loss of animals and livestock out there in the hundreds, possibly thousands, depending on how many graziers and things like that are out in those outback Queensland towns. So really awful, and something that everyone will be keeping a close eye on this week.
To Southeast Asia now, 4 more people have been rescued from the rubble in Myanmar nearly 60 hours after Friday's magnitude 7.7 earthquake hit, which also affected neighbouring Thailand. According to Myanmar's military rulers, at least 1,700 people are confirmed dead from Friday's quake and around 3,500 others injured, while thousands more are missing. Now, modelling Tara predicts that the death toll could exceed 10,000 people as search and rescue efforts continue this week.
That's absolutely horrific. And as for Thailand, we do know the death toll has climbed there as well, with at least 18 people now confirmed dead. Rescuers are working to locate 76 missing workers who are trapped under a collapsed skyscraper that was under construction in Bangkok, Chris.
Yeah, and the Australian government has committed $2 million to those rescue and search efforts in foreign aid. We heard about that over the weekend. But a point to make here is that the rescue and search efforts are becoming increasingly more difficult today in Myanmar and yesterday, where they were experiencing some powerful aftershocks. So that's making it a really, really tricky situation to navigate. Obviously, a lot of people would have seen the footage over the weekend, which is horrifying.
Yeah.
And another place that we're going to be sparing a thought and going to be looking at this week is Tonga. They experienced a magnitude 7.1 earthquake that prompted tsunami warnings for the country. They have thankfully since been cancelled and pose no threat to Australia.
Queensland's adult crime, adult time laws will be strengthened this week to include more charges, with hopes that it'll see offences like rape, aggravated attempted robbery, attempted murder, arson and torture included. Currently, only offences like murder, manslaughter and robbery are covered by the tougher laws, which are aimed at cracking down on youth crime and see youth criminals face the same penalties as adults.
The laws drew huge community backlash earlier this year in January when a 13-year-old boy allegedly stabbed a supermarket worker at a shopping centre west of Brisbane, only to find out that these new laws didn't include attempted murder, meaning the teen won't face the tougher penalties. Premier David Crisafulli says there's a plan for these 5 more charges to be added in when Parliament sits this week.
Yeah, I certainly hope that that is the case, because that's true. There was enormous outrage across the state when this stabbing happened back in January. And the reason that those other charges weren't first included in that first phase of the legislation is apparently because the government is working with an expert panel who are involved in the youth sector, and they're actually working with the government to decide which charges should be included, and they're examining each offence one at a time and basically trying to look out for the interests of the public, who obviously want to see youth criminals face fair justice, but also the youth sector is trying to also look out for these juveniles who often come from families with histories of abuse and neglect, and so they're trying to find methods that can both reduce these crime rates but also try help these kids that are offending and try and put them on a different path.
Yeah, and I mean, for Crisafulli, this would be something that he wants to do right away, given that it was an election, a key election promise of his. We saw him last week renege on another election promise, which was to not build more stadiums for the 2032 Brisbane Olympics. So the timing of this is very, very convenient for, the Premier over there. I think this whole issue of adult crime, adult time needs to be looked at very critically. We do have global experts that say tougher penalties aren't going to do much. But to your point, Tara, there is huge community outcry and they want something done. And, you know, whether this is that something remains something to be seen. That was a lot of some things, Tara. But hey, that brings our headlines to a close. Next up is Sacha Barbour Gatt's deep dive into a class action in the US that's impacting Aussie athletes. And Tara, you said you're keen to give this one a little bit of a listen because it's a topic close to home for you.
Yeah, that's right. I actually am a big American football fan in general, and I played it here in Australia for some of the women's clubs and played for Queensland, which is actually, I don't know if you know, Chris, how I got my very ugly, bent, broken wedding finger that was once crushed in a tackle and was 90 degrees at one point, looking a bit
those
better
are descriptors I did not need for a Monday morning, Tara.
Sorry about that. Very harsh imagery. But anyway, so I was playing for some of these clubs that are considered these kind of grassroots feeder clubs in Australia for any Aussies that are trying to break into college football and the NFL in the US. One of them was the Bayside Ravens, where Jesse the Monster Williams played, and he started off as a teen playing here in Australia and then went on to play in the NFL. So I'm very interested to see what's happening in the space and what on earth that fellow was saying about the NFL being invaded by outsiders and international folk. But we'll hear more about that next up in today's Deep Dive.
Hey, Sacha Barbour Gatt with you. We love to see an Aussie make it big on the world stage, and we're increasingly seeing our local exports cracking the NFL in America.
How are Australian punters taking over college football?
They're producing some of the NFL's top players.
I quit footy and decided to do this instead.
These players are coming from Australia.
Mitch Wishnowsky, who was born in Perth, Western Australia.
Aussie Lou Headley, one of the best punters in the country, lets this one fly.
Australia produces more talent for a single position than any of them.
But sitting just below the National Football League is college football, which is insanely popular and deeply ingrained in American culture. It serves as a pathway to go professional in the NFL, but also is a major economic driver and source of community pride. And did you know Aussies now account for half of all punters, that's a kicking position, at the top 134 college teams, and almost all of them have received full scholarships to play and study? You might be thinking, fair income, how great. But not everyone is happy. In fact, a class action lawsuit has recently been launched against the body in charge of the college athlete system by a disgruntled local dad who reckons what's happening actually breaches the US Constitution and antitrust laws. The National Collegiate Athletic Association is being accused in this lawsuit of stifling opportunities for scholarships and roster positions for US punters and establishing entry criteria that unfairly benefits Australian athletes. Another major bugbear listed in this lawsuit is that a lot of the Aussies heading there to play in college teams are significantly older and more physically mature than their American counterparts, giving them a significant advantage for selection. So what is going on with this lawsuit, and how are Aussies actually managing to crack into the college system and then the NFL? Dr Adam Cohen is a lecturer and the coordinator of the Sports Business Department at UTS. Dr Cohen, welcome to the briefing. Thanks so much for joining us. Do you think this reaction to Australian footballers, particularly punters, is fair?
Obviously, it's a perspective of who's reacting. And if you asked a sports fan of a team that has this awesome punter, I'm sure they love the import and what they're doing. But if you ask just a general population of, these middle 20-something-year-old folks are coming and they're taking our jobs, and my young kids are losing out on these opportunities to get college scholarships or pathways to the pros. And it almost kind of falls into a recent narrative that's going on in America a lot with international folks, immigrants in general, of obviously it's not as extreme as people stealing jobs in the general market, but it does kind of fold into that whole overall storytelling that's going on in recent years of something that used to be very American, NFL, gridiron is about as, blue blood as it can get in America. And now it really is starting to be invaded by the outsiders and the international folks.
Yeah. And look, as part of this lawsuit, some pretty serious allegations have been levelled at an Australian program called ProKick. And I do want to make the point, we did reach out to them and they didn't get back to us. But without going into the legal side of it, what role have programs like ProKick played in getting Aussie punters into teams overseas?
So there's obviously dozens and dozens of universities that have these positions that need to be filled. And they've started to, they have a whole recruitment process. And in the years past, it was, all right, we find the best American high school athlete. We go knock on their door, we extend them offers and things like that. But now as more and more people are learning about the sport and participating, there need to be pathways for these international folks to be able to reach these universities. So ProKick has kind of simplified the whole process where they cultivate the best talent here in Australia and train them up for how to leverage their kicking skills into more of a gridiron NFL type of context. And then because of their connections, they can call a coach or call an athletic director from an American school and be like, hey, I got this kid that would be perfect for you. Or I hear you had an opening. I got this person for you. So it's almost like a glorified, almost like a headhunter or the job seeker program is, okay, you have a skill. They need your skill. I'm the conduit to make it happen.
Yeah, okay. Have we been sending Australian players to the US to play in college football for very long, or is this a new phenomenon?
At the level that it's happening, it's definitely new. There's always been a handful or a couple Aussies that have either been at colleges or snuck their way into the NFL. But I think, for one, the NFL in general is getting more popular here in Australia. Whether we talk about just more people are watching it on TV or they've just become more global as a brand in general. And I think more kids are growing up realizing that, they still they play footy, they play NFL, AFL as kids, but they have this unique skill that potentially could be leveraged into this whole new sport that they see on their TV or they see on their social media, and they see the grandiose of the Super Bowl and events like that, and it becomes this new thing that they potentially want to be a part of. So as they become more interested and more engaged in the sport, then it becomes a potentially more popular from a performance standpoint.
Why are Australians particularly good in this punter's position? Because this is what the lawsuit is specifically referring to. Why punting? Why are Aussies so good at it?
A lot of it just comes down to just volume and how many kids in Australia are learning punting skills. In America, a punter, for those that don't know the role, it's a very minute part of the sport. You might see a punter on an NFL 5 plays a game, 30 seconds, a minute or so. It's a very nondescript role. It's not if you asked an NFL fan, they might be able to name 5 or 10 punters in the league, if that. It's just not like your quarterbacks or your running backs and your star players. But here in Australia, every kid, when you grow up, you get a football in your hand. At a very, 2 or 3 years old, you're kicking the ball. You're playing for your local footy team. You're going up the ladder. You're learning all these unique kind of skills in terms of putting spin on the ball or directions and hang time. So you just have thousands of more kids that are growing up learning this, and it's just a supply and demand. A certain percentage of them are going to be good enough to do the ProKick pathway or some other pathway to be able to use those skills in America in some fashion.
Can you explain to us how the US college football system works? Because I don't think we have an equivalent in Australia to explain or to compare to say, this is just how big this system is. Explain it to us.
Yeah, I'll try to do this really briefly. We could. That's a whole nother podcast to really dive into college football. But I love talking to my current students about just showing them images of what college football looks like, where you have 18-year-old, 19-year-old kids that are playing in front of 100,000, literally 100,000 people, 110,000 people. Their TV contracts are in the billions. Their television ratings, they'll have 20, 30, 40 million people that will watch big time college football games, prime time television slots. So they claim that they're not professional, but it's just as close to professionalism as it gets in terms of the money, the capitalism, the commercialization, the branding, the logos, the music, the bands. So it's basically, even though it is college sport, it's as professional as it gets.
Yeah, so explain then as well how much money there is to be made. Now, can players, because it's not technically professional, so technically players aren't getting contracts with money attached to them from their colleges, but there is money to be made, isn't there?
For sure. And it gets a little tricky with international students and what they're allowed to do in terms of name, image, likeness in collegiate sport, where most of their funds are supposed to come from internal sources within the school and not pursue external opportunities just because of visa reasons and tax implications and things like that. But you certainly do have athletes that just are generating income, thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars, and they're getting college scholarships that can be worth hundreds of thousands. So if someone's getting a scholarship to a school like Duke or a school like Princeton or Yale or a California school, those schools are costing $60,000 USD every year. So at the very least, just getting a college degree that can be worth $250,000 USD dollars. And then you have the allure of the pathway to the pros, the NFL, where we famously have an Australian punter that just signed a 4-year, $15 million USD contract. He's projected to have a 10-year, 15-year career where he's going to make over $50 million, $60 million USD in his career, most likely. So that in itself is, if you could even make the NFL, then you're going to be set for life and you're going to get locked into a nice pension and a nice career. And short answer to my long rambling is there's a ton of money in the space. And I'm sure young Aussies are starting to see that compared to, you can have a nice career in the AFL, but you're not going to be a superstar kicking for the Dallas Cowboys or the Ohio State University and playing in front of 100,000 people.
So is the goal then for most of the Australians heading over there, like they get the college scholarship, but the ultimate goal is to make the NFL so they can make all that money?
I would say it's split. And I'm sure you have like the stars that are going to the top tier Division I programs that Pro Kick has said, you have the skill to potentially make the NFL. You have like your A tier that you're going to get drafted, you're going to get a contract, you're going to have a career in the NFL. Then you have that next tier where it's like you have a shot at the NFL. It might be a long shot, but give it a go. But at the very least, you're going to be a successful college kicker. And then you probably do have a bunch that just want a free tuition and a free experience in America, that you get to go over there, you have a really cool experience, you get a great degree that could be worth $250,000 or so. Maybe you go on for your master's degree, or maybe it's a pathway for a visa or things like that. So I would guess a good chunk of them know that they don't have a shot at the NFL, but it still can open up a lot of doors.
Now, something else that was raised in the lawsuit was the age of the Australian players who are heading over there, and you've also touched on it. They're in their mid-20s, sometimes up to 10 years older than their college football counterparts who are, like you said, 18, 19, 20, and they're playing in this division. How is it working then that if they're having to go over and go to college, are they actually studying at the same time? Like, is that really happening?
Again, it kind of leans into the how serious are they taking school versus how serious are they just hyper-focused on sport. I would guess a good chunk of them still are embracing the student part of the experience and going to classes and pursuing a degree. But I'm guessing the ones that are at that top tier are really focused on developing their skill, learning the particulars about the NFL, and that's the priority. And some of these schools will have, we almost call them kind of like easy classes, or you just knockoff classes where you go and you have to, it's just like an easy C degree, or just something where I'm going to pass, it's going to be impossible for me to fail. And so, I guess the short answer is it depends. But there's certainly some that aren't taking the classroom as seriously as others.
Yeah. How many Aussies are we actually seeing playing overseas right now? And how many have we seen crack the NFL in a big way?
There's 61 punters out of, I think it's 133 Division I schools. So close to 50% of every top tier program has an Aussie punter right now. In terms of the NFL, I believe it's 5 to 6 right now that are in the NFL. About 30% of punters in the NFL are from Australia, which is a really high number for a country that never really even cared about the sport. I would guess that number is going to get bigger before it gets smaller in the next few years.
Yeah, well, I guess that leads to my final question. You know, the number at this stage is on the up, but do you think if this lawsuit is potentially successful, like we will see these programs, you know, and changes to how Australians are allowed to come in and play the NFL? And does that real desire exist on the ground for overseas players, Australians in this case, to be completely shut out?
One thing I've learned about college sport is never underestimate their ways to find loopholes or ways to get around stuff. If it's going to help the bottom line or if it's going to help the team succeed, I'd actually be pretty shocked if this class action really goes anywhere and they can really halt the brakes on. Again, maybe I shouldn't make that assumption, but it's just going to be a very difficult case for them to win. But let's say it does happen, that they are going to be able to figure out other pathways where maybe they start bringing in Aussies earlier into high school age kids and they target them at younger ages and create those pathways. Maybe they figure out ways to have student visas where they're not coming over to do sport, but they really are coming over to do sport. I would guess that the number still, no matter what happens, unless the U.S. government literally puts the brakes on international students in general or student visas in general, I would guess that pipeline is going to keep going in some capacity because college football is $1 billion industry and money talks, and the best talent usually rises to the top in the end.
It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing today.
Thanks for having me.
That was Dr. Adam Cohen, an expert in sport business at UTS, speaking with me there. And that is it for this episode of The Briefing. Thank you so much for joining us and for listening. Before you head off, we would absolutely love it if you could share this ep with someone who you think might get something out of it. It is a really easy way you can support us and all we do here at The Briefing. So we're sharing our socials posts. You can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We're also on TikTok and YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. Thanks for listening.